Saura Ghavila Sashay, Harla Strakrinnehe, a vi Korahach, a Corliv La Clee. Toran na Crinnehe, Oidhreacht Dalach, Crinu Runda Egendala, Idin na Corlori Carach Tuffa, agus Feimanig na Corle. Credach, Greven Taver Fui Chabadal, Chotachtach son. Gur hug Feimanig na Corle, Fullaid of dus na Corlori, Gevertadish ve Fragrach as Dishbiag a Corte, Damarode Goluhidish, Enrod a Dorach egen Crinu, Lesmo than Crinu Kena.
There was threats made that if this went belly up, that we could lose our houses, our property, and all the shillings and cents we had in the bank.
People were terrified, I suppose, of the consequences of what could happen to them.
Harlan Crinu Rundisha, nor a Tigach the Corlori, Grev Banishtiecht na Corle, Tresh Pisa Talon, Stadule Ashtu, Gedi Forberhor Privaidich, in Anistoiv.
Vidine Kar Soklekan or Nyagas, Kar emails Hogan Raw, Nifu Fractive. Níl of pawns.
Is Kintergrave she kunstbordach. Mar in Yaran lay the truer forbror I guessed and sieve shaw, August Hossashirik Tridley Kayla.
The most important issue at stake, as far as we were concerned, was that this was done without the knowledge of the council, without the knowledge of the public representatives, and therefore without the knowledge of citizens.
Anocht tus Bánimid cad gadírach a hitteach ta fír de hóirse dúnta na Corle Carach an saura tasaíúd. Ní haváin ganarda an scéalseo, ceistena tram chúiseach dóibh siúda bhí amon na tíre le lígan bora ach na méachta. Ach tugan an scéal léirgas, ceandas na cúisina go bhfuil an tír seo mar atá.
On to private members' motion. Motion re national monuments at numbers, monument at numbers 14 to 17 Moore Street.
Agus ceir bliana le dul go cumóra céad bliana éiríach 1960. Is dábhar dí spóireachta Cé cos táchtaí go lean faoi le forbert a bhí berta de ráidí chunil Oidhreacht nó go gaibh nófaí na fuidigineh ina raibh leichra na Cásca.
The government must not allow the destruction of the GPO battlefield site. And you, Minister, you're a proud...
Minister, please.
Waiting.
Chuck to Jerry Adams.
I'm appealing to the Minister.
Deputy Adams, please, to conclude.
You also know, I was not be a chorus jock or not be a chorus jock or
Le breis agus déimlíana tá gailta cineirí 1960 sáite siar chuimhlint I ggéir a tahaint an stad forbarthóir amháin a chos gur chuidhórdas na fuidigineh stairúla sráidí mhórga a lega, na fuidigineh in chathe sínsir a nóidanta derrig.
Sean Siamh is táhachtaí is star na fiche íse in éireann agus gur an siamh sin a Harlan achtra is smó a Harley sa tír seo a rihan fiú ís an ten achtra aró tunnachar idirnáisiúnta aige an achtra seo is be seo an chead éiríamach an naid an colíneacht an sa dán.
The evacuation.
In an éireachtaí stoppachar le scris na bhuidigineh stairúlasa, hána dar scéal corthach. Scéal a thug an léirgas éiring atá bhadónaí déal a saolaíoch a bhrógra na Cásca. Scéal faoi orbarthóirí go minic tamáinte ag saint, dingmháite hebras a bhainteach airigad an cháiní cóir, agus institútí stát hepóra las an phobal a chosint.
How special is that terrace? In what other country in the world would you consider demolishing it?
I became interested in this story back in the late 90s because it was evident that there was something wrong in a country which would leave its main street in its capital city in a derelict state for 3 decades. We are now heading into the 5th decade, and that site is still derelict.
Cumóra chuige blian éiríamach na Cásca 1960. Dhéanann stát ceiliúra olmhór. Ag an amson bhí íbert féidegus mná 1960 úr an aigna na daoine. Teach a blian níos déanaí bhí éiring athartha. Mar chinne chredmar gref slaurí ar staide achrannach catadína gyn. Bhí ar nach na mécht an ábhar éid fúd na hórpa. Bhí ré an tígur Celtic tacha.
Bhí drámáire a tír an ói a bhí an airigad a dhéanamh agus ceapsead go sé sin I bhhad níos táhachtaí nó aon rodile. So nuair a chaning sé go dtí ceistena nós 1960 tábhacht starú le cheanta sin ní rá sé sin a gceasta go bin éire.
Le lín ré an tígur Celtic, cnach agus díal sealúchas bun agus bar an scéil. Trí airigada in éistúa sealúchas, dhéal agus an son an brabúsa in éistúa sealúchas eile. Bhíar chumas daoine simana móra airigad a hiileh. Chred gilór daoine gur slí glistnecha seo le garim batha hiileh. Ach ar gilór slite, níor a chaun a fuirim eile de jaul glach Oidhreacht. A raibh mar chora caiúint chomá leis an buachant. Duine dó siúd a bhí meategan gluthe sealúchasa ba Paul Clinton. Altar a rathúile behé, ach bhí dawn an orbarthóra nó go thomlánda.
Well, I suppose you could say he was unorthodox in the sense that he was a relatively young architect in Dublin in the early to mid-90s. He used to ride around on a bicycle, which again doesn't quite fit with the image of the flash architect stroke developer. But he was somebody who had very original ideas, and he brought those ideas to the table in the form of quite an advanced proposal for O'Connell Street.
Le geola trecha blian bhí fellí déantar chud de ráidí chun Iniúchadh. Cuma láthir ar chugagire, seachas seód de chud na príomh catharach. In Oidhreacht nócha ceithir, rún pictúrlan an Carlton. Dógar córa na catharach, go ráidar a lorg smainte is fís le sráidí chunil a orbert. Más málas mihid a behan túirim chudianta. Sa chláir seo, nuair a luamíd sráidí chunil Uachtarach, sé tá geist ná na fuidignimh agus an talamh a chíanan ó bhar sráidí chunil, siar go dtí na fuidignimh stairúla sráid íhórga.
You had O'Connell Street, behind it was Moore Street, which was fairly run down, and a big dated shopping centre, the Oidhreacht Centre. So it was an ideal thing to link the three of them together, and it would create a critical mass that it could become the best shopping centre in the country, and it's on the capital street, so it was a really good bet.
Lorna nóchadí hánig Paul Clinton agus tíornaí talún áitiúla eile. Richard Quirk, Jim McGettigan, agus Colm Carroll le chéile, agus bhunaíodir an Carlton Group. Meallach roint fid gnó áitiúla eile chomá le páirteach lachas a scéim, ina measc feardar bhenim Joe Fury. Bhí cuidmhad an talamh inis idir sráidí chunil agus sráidí mhórga a bhí le forbert na fuidignimh stairúla snáidmh inis faoi smacht an Carlton Group. Láthir don sco a basaíomh an Carlton, ach bhí cúiseanna eile ann a dhéanaan saíomh sa luachmhart an forbarthóid. Mar chud de reachtaíocht an nuachan orbanig, bertaíoch gomach limistéráide him le clia, gohhéadad duine joch cad planála tógant chu go fáin géad dá chostaisí forbara a chur gcuine a bhíle cánach. Measach gomach sráidí chunil Uachtarach a measc na limistéir sa. Bhí an chumair go raibh an pota óir in nám de Clinton agus a cháirde.
If you go back to the mid-1980s, the extent of derelict land in Dublin City, inner city, was of the order of 300 acres and more. 300 acres in the capital city was derelict.
Tá go leor chredan gur món spreagah a chaun an talamh tréca Yesú, dámach cáin á bhaint ó na húnéirí seachas lascaine cánach a thuairt leníad a orbert. Toran na cainte faoi lascaine móra cánach, ná nár bhíad an Carlton Group bháin a bhecha géar a saíomh an Carlton a orbert. An príomh am a háir ba thuaisce Clinton ná Keelgrove Properties, cóchólacht den mhórchólacht aitheanta Treasury Holdings, a Taffy Stewart, Richard Barrett agus Johnny Ronan.
Now remember, Treasury Holdings at that stage were a hugely influential organisation, and when they saw the potential of the O'Connell Street site, I think it could genuinely be said that they could see opportunities there, and wanted in on the operation.
Bhui Clinton sa chuairt níos déanaí, go nuairte hacadóirí airgad sé an nám leis Irish Life, go greideach an chóirle bheith mí réasúnta mar a gasach sé le Treasury Keelgrove. Ach bhui Clinton sa chuairt, go nuairt céile ach Frank Dunlap leis, go meach sé chun na leasa bua le Treasury Holdings. Nuair dhéana marna tangháil le Treasury Holdings fé seo, dúlta siad éon rud rá. Sean Frank Dunlap céanna dad a bhóch liling bínte fisracha an mehan, go raibh tunna chur míg lethach a géir an góras planála, agus sa ghair na cuairtena ghabhlí an prísúntaachta ó hin as míchleachtas.
Clinton didn't take up the offer of taking on Dunlop as his consultant, and neither did he take up the opportunity to get involved in a partnership with Treasury.
Seans gomíonn min túriscí síníoch agus a cuireach faoi bhráid na cuairte inar admhaig Treasury Holdings go raibh a céasa forbarthóir córsan leo, chuna thaobh go raibh leiscear Clinton dul bart néireacht le Treasury Holdings.
This was where there was supposedly meant to be a building number 20 Moore Street, and they did admit to us that they were just using this to torture the hotel developer because it had a strategic nuisance value, and that's all it had really. It just didn't exist.
Sa deire tóga chóstáin har timpeall mion físa talún Treasury Holdings. Ach de réir fianna sé ho Clinton sa chuairt. Nuair a chur sé siúd an úl de Richard Barrett o Treasury Holdings, ná raibh sé an dolamon partnéireachta leo, ben freagra fuair sé ná. Nothing was going to happen in O'Connell Street until Treasury Keelgrove were partners. Reached nuair dhéana marna tangháil le Treasury Holdings fí seo, níor a feic le rácha. An fiche séú deire fór 1998, fuair an Carlton Group an cad planála bhí á lorgacha lena Millennium Mala Orbert. Faoi seo, mar a bhíthe sa túr, mar chuid de phlean cóháite limistéir bhlé clia, hí sráidí chuna luachtarach ainithe mar cheantar amach lascaine cánach ar fáil de Orbertháirí. Bhí Clinton agus an Carlton Group is sellh an puta óir. Is a bheabhsa raich an scéal dóibh, sa bblion 2002, dógad an taire airgadis Charlie McCreevy, lasathe an mil airgadis. De réir na lasathe sa, bheith ar chumas forbarthóra, caig go fáin géad, ní hamháin dá gostas forbartha, ach freisin caig go fáin géad de chostas canach na talún a dhíscríomh a gcuine cuid cánach. Bonan, cead planáil an Carlton Group agus lascaine cánach ar bhiú hartar 160 milliún euro.
That's what triggered all the developers around town wishing to pay lots of money for property because they were getting a tax break for it. It was insane economically.
Is cosúil go raibh forbartháirí áide ar an ólas faoin na limistéirí an na meach na lascaine cánachas ar fáil, fiú solar fógréach go hifigiúliad.
In our case, I was able to get a copy of the map of the sites that would qualify for the tax breaks before it was published.
Má tá sé ar ólas agat, cá bhfuil na lascaine seo le fáil. Is féidir leat is cosúil le bank a bheith ar oscailtas, do lábhar chóiristeach. Cinnal casino agus tá agat go mé an léróid de titim ar a bóca dearag. Ní féidir cáiliúnt má tá an tóla sin agat.
We've seen evidence to show that these integrated area plans were in the hands of various developers prior to actually being publicly released. Have you come across anything like that before? How do you explain that?
Well, first of all, the actual decision regarding the approval of an integrated area plan was a matter for the department and the Department of Finance, not a matter for the local authority. So landowners were asked to make submissions to us for inclusion in the preparation of the integrated area plan. So there was no great mystery about that. As to why and how it ended up in other people's ownership or I don't know. I really don't know.
Muoin Clinton gur minic gur díalach na testais lascaine cánachas a chuma.
It wasn't the person who had the building. They qualified for the tax break, but you could sell it to Mr. Moneybags over here or over there, who had a big tax bill. You could sell the tax break. So once you got the certificate stamped by the local authority, you could sell it.
Lor a gamer túrim na cóirle caharach ar an ráite sa, a chamid fós a fannacht le freagra. Dy'r túris good body gá víle sa sé I yin an Realtas Commissionu I gás forbertí a tugach fúha suasgadi dere gá víle sa cahir. Chosin scéimena rasacht cánach bona her limisteirir le, €1,983 milliún an gáiní cóir. Os roda gur taringeach nuas galoor na lúnta sos na blianta lan, teiktar dúin Iniúchadh go meg an fíorchostas an stad chiiste a bhad níos irde. Buinig, 64 fan géad so, leis an scéim, orbanach an nuachan.
It is a phenomenal amount of money. The city is just, I mean, we're almost bankrupt now. I mean, that's the reality, whether it be, refurbishment of our flat complexes, which most of them have been done, but there are still a few where people's living standards are very poor. If nothing else, even for the acquisition of housing on the open market now, where it's ridiculously cheap, it would make a substantial improvement in the huge waiting list we have of about 11,000 people.
Bhí an chumar scéalan is nach bheith faoi feic stoppach ar leis an Carlton Group. Ach, an tochtúláid diag bealtaine in 1998, chuig bhí riimist an Carlton Group cad planála gáil, for Paul Clinton facts o Keelgrove Properties a dúirt. Certain opponents of ours have underestimated our ability to cause legal chaos to their detriment. Is éigen a bhí cad planála feite an Carlton Group, ná gan in Treasury Holdings a chóirc leis an board planála. Agus nuair a hasan board leis an cad planála bhí tucha, in Treasury Holdings a chóir chuig na cuairteanna. Deire hir, taraigech an cás so siar. Bheith an bhuail a chur an nach chóirc sa umarcach do ghuine do chóilachahí Paul Clinton, an tuasal fury.
Joe had borrowed money on the strength of this planning commission coming through and the thing going ahead, but while we were in this entrapment scenario, it wasn't going to go anywhere, and I explained to Joe that there are a lot of hurdles ahead of us. Anyway, I didn't realise at the time, I didn't know at the time, Joe had his own financial difficulties that he was relying on this to get out of, and Joe committed suicide. He hung himself, leaving a wife and half dozen kids, which I always thought was the saddest part of the whole development.
E crothú más gá na fuid an cluthe sealúchaise gan ísportaig. Fuiere úil gá víle, hí gach bacht lihúil sáirithe. Bhí an chuma nar a bhánach ceistama go dtí go gud fi tús le tógant an millennium mal. Ag an amsa, níor a bhéanam níor ghailta lechran na Cásca maidir leis na fuidiganibh staidúla. Tháinig gaharú mátá an scéalsa, nuair a thugad ar faoi nera, lábháin go raibh an fleic os cún doras sa bhir séideag sráidí mhórga írig. Nuair iad an scéala isrú, fuair amach go raibh sé geist mar chuid an cad planála tugacht an Carlton Group, na fuidiganibh staidúla ar sráidí mhórga leaga go talamh.
The application that was lodged by the Carlton Group was for the redevelopment of the Carlton site. We granted permission for it, and in that development, it provided for the demolition of the buildings in question, yeah.
Is an isise chud fi tús le feachtas gailta lechra na Cásca. An bblion dar giún, chola siad nuacht go gapad ar san gur da scéala bhí an. Bé sin, go raibh sé geist ag an chóir le carach, ordú eigentach canaí nó CPO chur a bhaim ormhór do híomh an Carlton, an talamh a raibh na fuidiganibh staidúla san na áide. Bhuaig an cóirla go raibh 3 bliana caite ó tugach cad planála den Carlton Group. Ach de haidimh as éantas idir centenary an Carlton Group, ní a fiú fód casta, agus dá raibh nach raibh de gholasacach an CPO a chur a bhaim. Dearcha umlána ag súlar seo ag Paul Clinton.
There's been talk about the CPO threat had been actually there for years. It just didn't make sense because we'd got over the various hurdles and we'd just told the senior official that we were definitely going ahead in spring. We actually told him.
In court, Clinton claimed that the CPO with which he had been threatened was like a sword of Damocles over his head, And he was told that if he didn't bring in Keelgrove Properties as co-developers, that his site would be CPO'd and he'd never get this development off the ground.
A tuaid freagrad an líomhaintear ina Clinton gur a bé an aim te fear de Iniúchadh aimman I gáide him mainistíocht chomhairle le clia ná to procure the involvement in the site for treasuring Keelgrove. Dúirt ab chóide son na cóirle, I say and believe that the applicant's suggestion in this regard is without foundation.
Treasury holdings, you just look at them now. Sure, I mean, they were on a winner. On other things, they were going and they moved. Where did Carlton go? Carlton were too fond of bickering among themselves.
Níor chuir an Carlton Group fáilte rih chin na cóirle catharach CPO a eisiúnte a go talún. Ó hef cefnú na bhuiigeanmh stairiúlas ráidí bhórgade, chreid forhórdaíine gur dá scéal a bat an CPO.
Ceap mar an am sin go sort stop cótha leis an méid bhí tarlant maiall an Steve ordathe sin. Go an Stát agus an bardas tar éis rá tá an Steve seo tábhaach, tá sé starú, cáid brandú straach an Steve seo, cáid sort a bheith cínte gur darlíonn rudí mar gur chóir go dar óisiid. Agus ceap mar go méid sort ró lárnach níomháin aganne ach ag na rion agsúla sa rialtas náisiúnta comá.
And he heard the O'Reilly had left...
Baistigh de chúpla bliain joch gailta lechra na Cásca nach mar a síltar a bítar. Nos a síintir, viidir son tre seasa son an rud a chread a rán. Ach dáthora, níor vada go méidir son chomá I gwiflint leis an Stát. Fim líon rá bhíle sa dó, bhí Paul Clinton agus an Carlton Group a sáin. I níg dóibh an láb an uachtar a gháil a gcuid umathirí agus cad planála gháil le tógantar sráidí chonúil uachtarach, bhí an chuma nach fada gomach éirefacha an €160 milliún de lascaine cánach. Nuair a deisig an chóirle nolig rá bhíle sa héan, ordú éigeanta cannaí, nó CPO ar Stephen Carlton, dahraigh ga chéinaí. De bhar an cinne seo, cinne a bhuaigh Clinton sa chuairt duineach a bhábhar, Caurú le forbarthóir bhí an óíocht leis, líomhainn te héanaan an chóirle, bhí Clinton agus a Fortnéirí inis I máil gachrod a chailúnt.
The key thing is, under CPO compensation laws, you're not allowed to compensate for development profit. So if somebody has an old garage, it might be the site of a fantastic 20-storey hotel, but the local authority have to pay the price of the old garage. So therefore, they could CPO something for $1 million that can be sold for 10 million. It's an inherent flaw in the current CPO legislation.
Duine an linne, yin Partnéirí an Carlton Group a chórc chuig an board planála, maidir le cinenne na cóirle CPO a chur a bhaim ar a chuid talún. Bheadh rá áirithe ar chórc Colm Carroll agus Jim McGettigan. Ní chuir fí an CPO a bhaim formhór a go talún súd. Ní bheadh an tá céanna fach le Clinton ná an túsal cuirc. Ba cinan bhórd ná go leanfaí leis an ordú éigeanta cannaí nó CPO a gás talún na berta son.
We defended against the subsequent CPO. We fought that in Borpanola. We fought that in the High Court. We fought it in the Supreme Court. But it's just years of misery, really. And at one stage, we were down at the High Court. We had 2 cases going on in 2 different High Courts at the one time. My dilemma was I had said to the widow of Joe, the guy who had committed suicide, that I wasn't going to give in to these people.
A fiabhra á bhíle sa ceithir san áirtchóirt, tháinig ólas chun solas faoi chunra neamh gnách. Go gairid in na dhéag sin dógad partner Clinton an túsal cuirc, greibh sé taranta ar chórc siar, as greibh sé níos ríntinige chu talún na díal le forbrathóir ar le. Nuair a rialaigh an táirtchóirt de Gine Clinton, rinne sé a chórc ina éonar chuig an chóirt uachtarach. Nócha blian Zairi amach cumór an Oidhreacht séideag. Is ní raibh Carlton na leiachra rómhóra, ná raibh an CPO cur a bhaim, ná nach raibh na fuidiganibh stairiúil ar sráidí mhórga sellibh an stát. Chreididor mar a chreidir lán eile, gur be imachtaí cuairte Clinton ba chúis leis an Cásca bheith amhlaigh, agus cholúas a bheith siúd thart go gur fi an CPO a bhaim, agus go nglacach an stát sellibh ar na fuidiganibh stairiúla seo. Tháinig athrú omláin miónara, nuair a fuaireadar amach faoin chonra déanach tagarta san ardchuirt sa bhliain 2004. Conra neamhnach a bhíon sa, idir bhainisteocht chomhlibh le clia agus forbrathóir a bháin le.
I suppose when we first became aware of the contract that had been signed between city management and one particular developer, the present proposed developer at the site, we realised that the compulsory purchase order was being sidelined, was not to be triggered. That set off alarm bells.
Van bhliain chavíle sa ceathair an sin, bhí Avrasán, go mbeadh na cólachtaí eile Treasury Holdings, bhí buainte le rintcrothaí eile, agus an Carlton hain a bhí scailte ag a buinte sin. So bhí Avrasán go mbeadh siatsan in án dul a raí le forbrata be. Bhí bainisteachta na cóla ag a buinte sin, ag lorg dráméicin deile a bhruach an Albert a rai.
An forbrathóir tough an bautasá ná Joe Riley ó Chartered Land, fear aithnéir mar an duine dorbar anna Oidhreachta dún droma. Iniúchadh Chartered Land einfáir lacha sa chláirsa.
That there could have been other developers, but the only one that I see is a good developer from his track record. I don't know the people, I don't know them at all, but from their track record, they built Dundrum Shopping Centre.
Bhuíoch cóla na catharach gur hí níidir an conra neamhghnáchsa sa bhliain 2004, mar nar féidir le an CPO chur a bhaim de hairimh meachtaí cuairte Paul Clinton.
The council came up with an agreement which included a provision that if Chartered Land developed the site within 10 years, then the CPO would not be necessary.
Raim bliain ní beluathe chur an cóla núla Paul Clinton agus an Carlton Group, grauhas le CPO chur a bhaim ar a go talún. Tus gur hepadar ein dulchan cíine dhéanamh ar chead planála bhí co effectí bliana. De réir an chunra seo bhí has a tuairt ráthíocht de Chartered Land nach gcuireach an chóirla an CPO a bhí aontaithe I bhaim effectséifse hartar 10 bliana ar an gníal go bhór bródís an suíomh le líng na tséifse sin. An na ghiné behúnta saí faoin chunra seo ná cad a bhí ráite ann na thárlóch dá gaileach Clinton a chás cuairte agus dá raich an chóirla raig agus an CPO a chur a bhaim.
The agreement was framed in such a way that if there was a CPO imposed at any point, that the beneficiary of that CPO would be Chartered Lands. In other words, their section of the site would not be CPO'd, but the CPO on all of the other parts of the site would revert back to Chartered Land and become part of the development.
De ráite sa fór Iniúchadh ón Iniúchadh agus planála, land or buildings that are compulsory purchased would not be for the purpose of selling on. Ach de réir an chunra seo go díreach a bhí rintin ag cóirla bhaile atha clia dhéanamh sa chás gur cuireach an CPO a bhain.
It was, that was the writing on the wall that this thing was over. It had become more of a lost cause. The damage was already done. It was going to be hard to outmaneuver the logic of this.
Fwy rho'r orpach maidir a tarisgantí pai bli. Da gwyrych yn chorl yn CPO sio faim, tan chwma gymach dúlgas glahwyl yn gorle, ein chwnre le togant yn talafsa yn son, a chwrymach harisgant pai bli. Le linga chór Clinton sa chórt, fi or lauri har ciawn na córla treisio ra, go sio gydir a dís. Ach trin chonra sio hinú, fi an córlas cosúla cintú, fiú da gud fi an CPO a bhaim, nach mach a chayan orberhór a bháin a mech a chumas an suíomh sio a Orbert.
Well, it was astonishing. The idea that city management would sign a contract behind closed doors effectively saying we'll compulsory purchase an entire site in the city centre, but we won't trigger that compulsory purchase. We'll facilitate you as the sole developer.
Níor chrasaise siad nintina chorbe go raibh táhacht starú le baint leis cheantais. Agus tá sin solar an daí gníomhí siad an méid tá scrífa faoi ag nám agus na mínithe thug siad ir.
Hig na Gaelta go mechar a feimú go tapig.
Hánig cuman an nóna náisiúnta, Gaelta, leichre nídeg sédeg, hang siad san an túram, gur a bhiú níos mó fisrú a dhéanamh faoin ghaí go rá an scéil sinna do le rá, agus chuir siad sin coip den chanra seo le teatral dráns a bhí déanta ag go ggóla carach, go dtí na cóileoirí, ní rá sé ar ólas ach go brimhe.
Bhí na cóileoirí ar buile, mar chreideadar go raibh bainisteocht na cóile siad an chunra seo a híniú taifíor dan rám, ag sáú a gcearta mar ionadathe tofa.
The council voted to CPO the land, and then it appeared that the city council managers were putting back on that, and that infuriated councillors because we felt fundamentally undermined.
Saura corrathach a bheith saura na bliana gá bhíle sa sé, le crunethe tasaí ceannaí go chéile, idir cóirleoirí tofa agus bainisteocht na cóirle.
Well, we dealt with the management who would have had the hands-on around development. Would have been Assistant City Manager Sean Carey. I would have dealt with him both at these meetings primarily and also in my role as chair of the planning committee. He would have been the person taking the lead on much of this.
I stuck a gromit gur aile mac. An with midne Iniúchadh an seo, no will an bainisteocht an with streets in Iniúchadh. Agus sinna fágarrás an argón dan.
An tuairim coitianta ná gur ag cóirleoirí atá an focail scoir maidir le ordú CPO a chur bhaim. Nuair a dhéanaan Iniúchadh an scéala isrú leis an rainn tíocht agus planála, tug a chráitis a scríban dúin a thugann rud canan céanna le fis. Ach, rainn seachtaí na dhiac sin, fuair mar ráitis eile ón rainn. Na dúirt go raibh an chéad ráitis mí chrainn, agus gur faoi bhainisteoch údarásáid tú le bháin, cuasaí CPO chur a bhaim, agus nach bhfuil éon ról statúideach ag ionadathe tofa ina le héad.
Tá cóchtaí déan leathacha ag na cóirleoirí, agus an rud a dhéanann na cóirleoirí ná bhótálann siad ar an bland an chathair, ar an bland forbartha. Ach an dhéag sin, maidir leis an chur an gníomh, téann siad go dtí bainisteoir na cathrach, agus caithfidh bainisteoir na cathrach na céimeanna a ghlacha.
Nuair a dhéann cóirleoirí iarach ceist na chur a bhain leis an éon túsá, dúrach leo go raibh an tábhar faoi láthair mar chud de meachtaí cuairte, agus nach bhéad faoi é phlé de bhar bail a bheith ann, go bhéad faoi díosbeag a cuairte a chur na le.
The interpretation of that was so tight that it didn't allow for any proper discussion or debate on the issue. And also, there was threats made that if this went belly up, that we could lose our houses, our property, and all the shillings and cents we had in the bank.
Ábhar mór buartha eile de cóirleoirí a bheith foraíil san éon tú, inar gheabhann cóirle gníaladí sin talamh sa le chartered land ar luach lídathe an CPO. Ach, dá deipech ar chartered land an suíomh Orbert, go mbeadh ar an cóirle luach an bharga go dhéal leis an talamh I chinneach a rais.
Cílíonn sé sin an cóile a bheith á dhéal ag price ísio, agus go mar rud go mbeadh sé ar ceannach a rais ag price I bhhad níos éirde. Ní féidir rá gurúr cílhar é sin, tá sé anait a fad.
Do the maths. Very, very bad deal. Bad for the city, bad for the taxpayer.
Tá luach na talúna éiring tris tuitrim go mór an bliana gá víra sa sé, agus dá réir iad faoi rá ná raibh an socrú a dhéanann cóirle sa chása cho holtson. Ach, cafar a chuoineh nuair I síníoch an conrasa ba an tuairim coitianta ná gur an áde a raibh costas talún. Sa deire hir an tuíoch go bléfaí an taon tú nebhach seo ag cruniú speisialta ar an fiú saoin gá víra sa sé. Bheith gach ní a phléfaí ag an cruniú seo rúnda agus bheith coscar cóirleoirí tofa éí a thugach an cín ag an cruniú a phlé lesmuda. Tá cóip de bhemram a scap bainistíocht na cóirle chomhlóirí ag an cruinniú sin ficithe ag Iniúchadh. Sa bhemram seo deirtear. The properties which were the subject of the CPO are now largely in the control of Mr. O'Reilly, who has also purchased adjoining properties. Sa bhemram céanna deirtear, based on ownership and contracts to purchase in existence at the time, irrevocable contracts. Bín in chúis gur síníoch an tentú le Joe O'Reilly.
Well, mas cuiine me gart viidir rá ag an am sin go rá an talamh fád timpeall an siomh sin in a hell of féin.
In November 2006, the council officials informed councillors that at that point, as in November 2006, Chartered Land controlled most of the site. This was in sharp contrast to the memo a number of months earlier in May, when the council had claimed that Chartered Land owned the majority of the site before the agreement was made in 2004.
Der cuardach Oidhreacht a talúna commission Iniúchadh, nuair a hínig an chomhairle an túsal le Chartered Land a fiabhrach á bhíle sa ceithir, níor a bhéon chuid an talamh tugach cad planála den Carlton Group an 1998, agus eisiach an CPO sa bhliain á bhíle sa héan, chláirithe an ainim cólachtaí le Joe O'Reilly iad. Ní bhhaint son, ach de na chlárlanna céanna sa bhliain á bhíle sa 6, blian in an chruinniú in camera sa bhliain á bhíle sa 6, ní raibh a chartar ceathrúd an talamh seo chláirithe an ainim Joe O'Reilly. Dar nói ní honan sa agus ná raibh smachtaige hala bheile, nó nach raibh an ceartaige tala bheile chinech. Díramar an ggóirle ligan túin féchant na irrevocable contracts seo a bhí ag Chartered Land sa bhliain á bhíle sa 4, agus dúradúr ba chúislón conra híú sa chéadúil síos. Go dtí seo tá teipithe ar níoreachtaí. Céna filter a choréan bhí úmpara le aon daoine ggóirleh le clia a daca le scéal an Carlton. Tá bunús má le stair chun spóid is cleachtas planála na cóirle. Tá bhar seo, bheith fiad an túrin béidir go mar tréhearcach an chóirle níos oscailte na mar a bhíocht trá.
At one point it was reported in the Sunday Business Post that a council spokesperson had said that all he had ever seen is the front cover of the agreement and had never read the document itself.
You say you've never heard anything of this agreement?
In the context like that, I haven't been, you're talking in terms of, say, a development that went through the planning process back in 2008. But I'm not aware of any kind of previous kind of agreement in place with them.
For a senior planning official of the council not to have been aware of the existence of that 2004 agreement, given the controversy that surrounded it and the chaos that ensued from it between the councillors and the officials, is quite extraordinary, to say the least.
Níag dúin agla bhí anna bhleor labhraí na cóirle, chuir mar faoi ghó sra ceist na eile bhuidim scríofa faoin am ráid. Agus an chlársa dul ar an éir go dtí seo, ní léon reagra feitigain ar na ceistena seo helanas. Conna hefur hínig bainistíocht cóirleh le clia an is donna honadathe tufa, aon tú rúmda le Joe O'Reilly. Nó nach raibh an nám aon chuid an talamh ar thaobhann Carlton chláirithe in ainim cólachtar bit a chuid. Conna hefh gur hilig an chóirle go naistófaí talamh a dhéanfaí CPO éisiúntar go Chartered Land. Seachas an tentú leis an suíomh orbert a chur amach ar thairiscin peblií mar a bhí dúglas tleach ar a dhéanamh. Conna hefur hilig an chóirle de chlása san tentú a chéalaigh sa chás gur bhíon leo an talamh sa chinech a rais, gur raibh gach seansan go meach ar a praís a bhead níos mó díal ná an praís ar a díal siad sa chéadláe. Conna hefur tugach galún to Chartered Land, nach gud fi an CPO a bhaim feig hartar 10 bliana, nó na tugach 8 bliana den Carlton Group le haig cad planála den sort céna. Ná ní léon reagra feite goin conna hefh nar tugach ólas níos crinne de chorlóirí tofa sa bhliain á bhíle sa 6, ma idir a ceanúnéireacht go díreach a bhí ag Joe O'Reilly ag an nám ar thaobhann Carlton. An bhliain in íag don chruinniú in camera, dúltaigh an chóir Oidhreacht da chóir Clinton. Seachas gur hínig bainisteocht na cóir an chunra nebhnách, bhechan is séar a gomas san CPO chur a bhaim. Dréir téirmí an chunra seo, damar o dégin iana díse le héadin is, bhechar an talamh a bhronna ar Chartered Lands, agus sáú a bhechan seo ar frór orpach. Fíran in scéal nach ra bhéonchá níos móig an chóirle ordú éigeanta canige chur a bhaim. Mar, faoin amsa, bhí an chosúlacht air gur raibh formhór dúnéirí talún sa cheantar, treis sampl an tuasal cuirca leanúint, agus a go talún I dhéal le Chartered Land.
Díal daoine an talamh le Chartered Lands an sin. Tis go rá sé le taispáinteag Chartered Lands, go mbeadh sé tíochtthócab ar an chuma. Dágurí an CPO seo a bhaim, go mbeadh an cóla I gceistú na talúna go dtí iad, mar sin bheadh se chumá a dhéal, agus beidir price níos fiara áilhhaid Chartered Lands, nó mar a bheadh a fáil on CPO.
Well, it's clear that the purpose was that one particular developer would become the owner of the entire site.
Mar a hála, bheith chábhlíon eile ann sula glárófaí éon chuid an talamh ar thuidig an tuasal cuirca dhéal in aim chólachtaí do chuid Joe O'Reilly. Mar a léiríoch sa chéad chuid an chársa, bhuaigh Clinton gur bhain an chóirle míleasas a ggóchtaí CPO, le brú a chuir dul a bartnéireacht le forbarthóir a bháin, líomhainte héanaan an cóirle. Ach, an cosúlacht ar an scéal, gur chaúraigh an conra seo síníoch le Chartered Land leis an cóirle úsáid a bhaint as a ggóchtaí CPO ar clí ná raibh sé riamh a gceist gníonfaí. Haring an chunspóid ar fad a bhain leis an taonú nebhnách seo go leor áde, agus áde ar achtas na Gaelta chomá. Chábhíle sa seacht, fuair ar luachas saothir, nuair a damnig an tair a cóhí leireacht agus rialtasáid túlaigh an am, Dick Roach, I bhid a ceharde go dtí seachteag sráidí bhórga agus an talamhas na fuidigan a bheith a gúil mar héad chóra náisiúnta. Der 8 na séad chóirí náisiúnta, bheith aon duine thuaireach faoi thógant I gcóngaracht na bhuidigan seo a brise an dlí.
Henry Street, O'Connell Street, GPO.
Okay, thanks.
That's the national monument.
To the point of surrender. So the undertaking to preserve the national monument was not alone an undertaking by the minister, but it's actually that designation was an order adopted by the Oidhreachtas. So both houses of the Oidhreachtas are bound, in our view, are bound to honour the undertaking to preserve the entire national monument.
Bhí an chumar in scéal go raibh na Gaelta tris churan luí ar an stát an tácht a bhain le caibhnú na bhuidigan seo. Áit dar le go leor daoine a bunaíoch an stát. Maidir le Paul Clinton áfach a chuir a phlean forbartha de ráidí chuna luachtarach faoi bhráid na cóirle I lár na nóchadaí, bhí an chumar gur naisce bhí chu dibre ar fad. Ach mar a ha fice gon go díosas sa chlár, ní mar a síoltar a bítar sa scéal seo. Iniúchadh an cinenne fuidignamh stairiúlas ráidí bhórga anim nú mar héad chóra náisiúnta, an bhliain dar giún 2008 bhronn cóirle le clia, cad pleanála le haig ionad sipadóireacht do thógant is ráidí chunúil Oidhreacht ar Chartered Land. Bach an orbert seo a bhad níos mó ná Millennium Mall, Paul Clinton.
In total, the plans known as Dublin Central cover a 5.5-acre area, which stretches from O'Connell Street to Moore Street and from Henry Street to Parnell Street.
Hialle cinan aire go meach sin is a gúin lí tógan to gcóngaracht na fuidignamh stairiúla. Nuair a dhéon fí a chóir gur chead pleanála Chartered Land, chuireach a méid a chluiseach na Gaelta I géisteach an bhórd pleanála átachtara.
In the entire planning application, there's no mention of building on the national monument. It was only through campaigners raising that question at the oral hearing that finally council for the developer admitted that the proposal is to build on the national monument.
Cúiseáthas sé bhí an mar sin das na Gaelta nuair a dúiltaigh cigear an bhórd pleanála de chead pleanála Chartered Land.
On board Planola has told developers, Chartered Land, that a massive shopping centre is suitable for the site. but not a 13-storey high-rise with a sloping park in the sky on top. This latest controversy follows Dublin City Council's decision to allow most of Sean Dunn's massive scheme for Bulls Bridge. This was also overturned by Iniúchadh Pleanála, who said it was against the council's own development plan. Conservationists say it should be resigning time for city officials.
It's a credibility collapse. How can you have these people occupying senior planning positions in the City Council when all of their major decisions over the last few years have been overturned by Iniúchadh Pleanála? Their credibility is now sub-zero.
Níor bhaid faoi sibh na Gaelta bhad. An séoláid diaag mórta 2010, Iúltaigh board an bhór Pleanála de chinne gigerí féin, agus ó cad Pleanálta faoi choníalacha Oidhreacht de Chartered Land. Bain príomh choníal ná gimach cad an eide I tastáil. Bheach tauchaí na bhuidigan of staidúla níos a live an eide. Fiúlas an cinnis an fós le techt. Bhí bacháin eile mar gádal an necleis, so the bhéatach Chartered Land fód a chasa siomh an Carlton. Ainiuin go raibh chumas na cóirle ó 2008 an CPO chur a bhaim, de heidirh an aontú neamh nach, agus de bharga gredador go raibh Joe O'Reilly tríis tahainte bhormhór dúnéirí talún sa cheantar a go talamh a dhé leis níor bhacadar sa I dhéanamh. An anas do go leor, I gás an tír na talún is mó sa cheantar an tuasal Cork, bhí Paul Clinton tar éis meachtaí cuairte éisiúnt a gcuinneamh an tuasal Cork, an mán nach raibh sé de cheartaige íorfort néir an talamh áirithe son na gíal de Chartered Land gan na chead. Bhí cad ahrenú cuairte feite Clinton chomá le an aontú neamhghnáthaach. Ach an son go toban 2010 haring Paul Clinton siar ag gníomhaireach cuairte. Bhí na Gaelta feire an aire, ach féin bliain 2010 bhí éiring ahrathe, bhí an bhullagóid tríis pléasca.
The jaw-dropping slide in Irish bank shares today is unprecedented for recent times. There have been big falls lately, but this one was enormous.
Níor bhain na héile de simana móra airige de choigh an saint agus an chibhlinn tar fad. Inis bheachar an státchiste na buinca háráil. Der túriscin bheanach a dolamhigh Anglo-Irish Bank nolig 2007, ba onan an fithe ísacht bevó sa bhanc, agus séideag fan géad de laur ísachta an buink. Ag bar an liste bhí Joe O'Reilly, Chartered Lands.
By 2007, while he was completing the assembly of the site, Joe O'Reilly had already drawn down borrowings of 1.2 billion from Anglo-Irish Bank, and he had a facility to borrow up to 2.2 billion.
Saura 2009, Yin réaltas na héireann na billiún darigad chaoiní cóirí na tíre a churisteach a Mount Anglo-Irish. For Chartered Land a gá ísacht. Ceann bhiú 9.5 milliún euro agus ceann eile bhiú 5 milliún euro dá Vorbert Friday chonel.
Díreach go buinte go rá an stát, buinte na héireann a chu agad isteach Mount Anglo-Irish má hampla. Bhí Joe O'Reilly ó Chartered Lands a fáil isachtaí ó Bank Anglo-Irish. Ní chan an siar seo a chuomhnú ach chun leannacht a ráile a bhálbert forbet dá leis an lán daoine a churans chuomhnú náisiúnta I mhuiil.
Nís luithech nocumar go raibh forálacha fíor neamhghnách buint le aontú I síneach idir bainisteocht na cóirle agus Chartered Land. Ach an rud nárluamar ná an tagart a bhí san aontú seo de bhancan forbaróra, Bank Anglo-Irish.
Má hepan Chartered Lands, céad a hallóid don inistíocht don orbit don flanál. De rinn na termítá an is sé Anglo-Irish Bank, bank an ói á leis an stát an is ach ribhe sin bank a bhí gafa le umpa at go leor maidir le chúsaí inistíochta. Is ag a mang sin a bheith sé le ránú, céithiochas a go Oidhreacht de Chartered Lands.
Beidir go bhfuil deire leis an gonra inis an gheall gur chur toscaí seachtracha ó wathaí. Tá tarlíonn sé sin le conirthaí go bhuíochas na báirtethe go minic.
Der cóirlibh le clia I ggóthaíoch san stadach na míochta go bhfuil de déanamh siar bhna tóireacht ar a seasamh I leithin na an túsa. Chroigh géirchéim na manc agus an tuite me margan na tíhíochta dúlán olmhór don vorbarthóir bevó tá hífiú. Fuim bhléana rá bhíle sa te, bhí feib airgadis dagad féin ag bertas na forbarthóirí a bhí lárnach i scéal an Carlton, Treasury Holdings agus Chartered Land. In nig de fol Clinton Clishan Carlton Group of bhunna sé féin a lár na nóchadaí a eiscint, agus an son na nig don chóirle eiscint a geisiún CPO a lethe chuid talún féinnig, agus an lascan icánach ar bhíú 160 milliún euro sleanú as a lá, cheapach daine go gcuideach an cúlú eacnamíochta deire go thomláin le Paul Clinton, ach níor daine Clinton airías go héasca. Marachna cymor nór a fór Clinton amach go raibh Earfort Nair, Richard Quirk chun cuidan na mór do híomh Carlton a dhéal a Joe O'Reilly, deise sé meachtaí cuarta le sochas stop. Hín Clinton é seo, tuis gur bhuaig sé go raibh lesaige sa talamh céanna agus dá réir ná raibh sé de cheartaigh an tuasal Quirk an talamh seo a dhéal gan na chead. Mar a ha ficithe goin, bhí scéal an Carlton cráite le meachtaí cuarta. Is cosúil go chreid cóirleoir de chuid Fine Gael Jerry Breen go mar é dá bhéad faoi ceanile a chachant ar fad.
Myself and Paul Clinton met with John Tierney, the city manager, and Michael Stubbs, the assistant city manager in charge of planning. Their focus was on resolving what had to be resolved and trying to make sure there was there's some progress on the site, on the Carlton site.
Der cuarda chunéireachta talúna chumisnig Iniúchadh, bhí las de bhéad na agsúla Clinton 7,300 méadar cánacht an talamh a bhí Richard Quirk a géar a dhéal le Chartered Land. Bonansa agus beag na cháisian den talamh a tugach cad planála den Carlton Group an 1998 agus a deisi cóir le Black Lia, CPO sa bliana rábhíle sa héan.
I think after 9 years of fighting it, I had said to the widow of Joe, the guy who had committed suicide, that I wasn't going to give in to these people. His widow, Chrissy, said it was okay if I gave up. And I had done enough so I ended up just selling my interest, that instead of being told I didn't own anything, I got paid for my interest. So.
Chábhíle sa hocht, dhéal Paul Clinton an las a bhí geisiú de talamh saobh Carlton le Joe O'Reilly.
I suppose in retrospect, the way the property market has gone, I probably got a very good figure. But it's when Chartered Land came on board that time, they were the only people to ever offer me a decent figure. Prior to this, we had to give away a half share for nothing, or I was getting paid peanuts.
Is Iniúchadh dógur Clinton go raibh sé gairías a chásan na cuairt ar fad, mar éon lena abhrenú cuairte ar an aontú neamhnách. Is cosúil gur chreidir son a bhí páirteach go mar las Clinton a chinach go dair ná ír ar na cuairtena bide a thuairt ar an gceist. Ordaíonn an scéal a daimse Carlton na Cásca go leor ceistena do orbarthóirí, chomhlóirí Black Lia, agus dóibh siúd a bhí gócht réaltas ag an nám. Ceistan na fuléon ragraí ar le fáil. Tá an scéal lán de líomhaintí agus frilíomhaintí. Cúisim ní go háirithe na líomhaintí cuairte a dhéon Paul Clinton. Tá go leordas na líomhaintí seo Clinton, bunathe amachtaí deirtar a hála le líon crunithe réamh iarratais planála idir forbarthóirí agus bainistíocht chomhairle Black Lia. Le fáil amach an raibh bhán ús le líomhaintí Clinton, lora Iniúchadh cad an uirig ón ggóla fechant ar na mintúriscí a bhain leis na crunithe sa. Ní raibh ar gomas éon mintúriscí a aimsiú de crunithe idir an chomhairle agus an Carlton Group ná idir an chomhairle agus Keelgrove Properties. Ní raimsí marna ach raincá péis a bhain na crunithe idir an chomhairle agus Chartered Land.
I think this is one of the most extraordinary aspects of this whole affair. I mean, as far back as the 1995-96 period when all of this development began, there was a series of weekly, monthly, bi-monthly meetings between various interested parties, developers, architects, meeting with council officials on what was one of the most important developments, potential developments in the state. And yet, for years, there were never any records of those meetings.
Before 2008, you weren't required to keep records. You were required to keep them from 2008. The application in 2008 was lodged by Chartered Land, and there would be copies of some records there, but I think we've admitted and we accept that some of the records were not kept, and these would have been records of meeting between, say, our senior planning officers and agents, you might say, for Chartered Land, like the architects and that, and there was some defects, and we've accepted that, and we've put in place protocols to ensure that all records on all pre-applications are now kept.
Buineann na dlíomhaintís trom chúisí sa chláir leis na cóchtaí CPO atá ag bainistíocht cóirlí agus an éidireacht atá ann miúsáid a bhaintas na cóchtaí sa. Le ling an chláir seo cholamar líomhaintí cúplabáta gur bhain cóir le blea clia úsáid as a cóchtaí CPO le cabhrú le forbarthóir amháin a gcuine forbarthóir eile.
I've said that there's a need to revisit the compulsory purchase order system we have in this country. As a result of this and other instances where in my book it has been used to ill effect.
I was told back in the late 1990s by one of the developers involved that he personally contacted a senior minister through a former advisor, a former senior civil servant, and told the minister in detail what was going on. It appears that nothing was done on foot of that representation.
Tuigtar den nucha go raibh scéal an Carlton cheandas na Cásca spreag an taire cóhíl John Gormley, 2010, lena ógurt go raibh seach an comisiú a dhéanamh thuairis go dhéanach ahreanú an bróises planála I 7 údarásáitiúil de friúil, cóirlibh le clías an áireamh. Nuair a tháinig an córéaltas a gócht fithe héníag, chuidir son na fisrucháin nebs blachas sa thar ceall, agus chuir fisrucháin an bheanach ar bonna na áit. Meheh fithe dó díag, fáil síoch torra an isrucháin in bheanach sa.
There was no substantiation of any corruption. There was evidence of areas of the planning system that were not well administered, areas that needed to be changed and that needed to be clarified.
Choi blianna diag in ag de fáil Clinton fís maidir le forbetráidí chunil Oidhreacht a churfaí bhráid na cóirle. Tá codanna den tráid a cheartta bheith mar ábhar mórtais fós ina Oidhreacht. 62 meheh fithe héníag, scríomh Chartered Land chuig an éire Alaina, Oidhreacht agus Gaeltachta a lorg $100 aigle na gad planála agus tógann híomhann siad chóra náisiúnta. Der córagras atá ficithe Iniúchadh is cosúil gur chuir an gníomhaireacht náisiúnta am bhainisteoch sochmhainní nó náma €4 milliún ar fáil de Chartered Land leis an tíreachta sa a Oidhreacht.
So we have the rather strange situation that a state-subsidised organisation, NAMA, paid out of the public purse, are facilitating or about to facilitate the demolition of a national monument that the state undertakes to preserve.
The developer in question is, of course, insolvent, and in NAMA, a state agency with a direct responsibility to the people of this state. Does the government seriously hold out the prospect of a busted developer on a NAMA life support machine suing the minister for fully protecting a national monument?
I know it suits some to focus on 14 to 17 to protect it, and that's all very well. I'm sure it will be protected, but that's not the point. The whole area is a battlefield site. Dublin City Council have a lot of questions to answer on this, going back to 1998 when the Carlton Group were given planning permission.
Fuil láthir is bine bín á riamh an cheist faoi Orbert Sráidí chunil Oidhreacht. Dúin áirithe an dúirim gur cheartan éire cadahuairt an orbarthóir leanúint leis an chead pleanála tá feitige agus tógann híomh an siad chóran náisiúnta. Agus an lábheile na Gaelta agus go leor eile a bhábhar gníon faoin suíomh omlána Orbert ina láthir an óra agus mar ráid de bhealach tar is óirí.
It is not clear how a battlefield site project could be developed in light of the existing
the existence of an extant planning permission. This permission was granted by An Bord Pleanála, the independent body set up by the Oidhreachtas to adjudicate on planning consents where disputes arise as to whether or how developments should or should not proceed.
Agus an cláise dul ar an air tá Gaelta lechra na Cásca fósa fiche ver chinna naide.
Without their dogged commitment to Moore Street, we could be sitting in a worse situation now. We could be living on half a building site. We could be living on half a development. At least now we're still dealing with a blank canvas. We could have been in a far worse situation only for those people. They need to be commended as doing the public service when there's people being well paid who didn't preserve those buildings, perhaps didn't wish to preserve those buildings.
Oidhreacht na Cásca. Cad a bheith de fiscin te goine cmóra céad bliain naide go séideag. De bhar fianna sé agsúil, cuide tá léirithe sa chláir seo. Tá gach sean saon. Go béh rud a bheith os ar gór ná na húdará stát, sáite I gcuimhlinn cuairte le Gaelta na naine a dhéon íbert ar son an stát nó. Beag sráidí chuna Oidhreacht fósa go leúnturing. I chodí bhuain, caite, tréce is atá aniuh.
Agus a cháirde ar leiscail go Oidhreachta beganí má leiscéal na híon nacht ach fannaí léine mar go mé Hugo Duncan a damsa agus a ggólín ar stáitse apraí Iniúchadh inis fí an cúpla núméid. Agus níos stearnaí annach de buig faointí rally idir ilchríocha a bhí ar siúl sa Mulgáir ar Motorsport Ireland.